government does not oppose waiver of the defendants appearing for arraignment, and also says that the government will confer with the defense and make a joint proposal regarding pretrial litigation. So remember, this case, after it was in the Supreme Court, was sent to the Court of Appeals. That three-judge panel then sent the matter back to the district court, that is Chutkan's court. Let's go ahead and get to Jessica Levinson, of course, a CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor. Jessica, does this come as a surprise, or was there some sort of deadline for both parties to confer to get this case to move forward?
This is not a surprise given the timeline that was laid out in Judge Chutkan's courtroom, and it's not a surprise that this was refiled. I think you and I had the opportunity to talk briefly after the Supreme Court decision came out in the Fisher case. Of course, that was a case dealing with somebody else involved in the events of January 6th. But the Supreme Court, as you mentioned, was analyzing one of the statutes that former President Trump is charged under in the D.C. election interference case. And the question for the Supreme Court was, does this obstruction statute, which was a post-Enron era statute, really prior to January 6th that applied to white-collar crimes, could it apply to people involved in January 6th? And what the Supreme Court did very briefly is narrow the scope of that statute, but allow enough room for Jack Smith to do what he did today, which is to say, I understand the statute that I'm charging Trump under has now been narrowed in its scope, but I can still move forward because of the allegations against the former president.
So, Jessica, given that this grand jury was being conducted after the Supreme Court decision, are the charges different? Because I'm trying to look right now at the original indictment filed in August of 2023 against Donald Trump. I'm seeing 4 counts: conspiracy to defraud the U.S., conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. And now I'm looking at the new superseding indictment, and I am seeing what looks to be the same counts.
Yes. That is exactly what I saw as well. And that's what many people predicted, which is that all 4 are going through, meaning all 4 counts are continuing. And the thing that changed is for Jack Smith to go to a grand jury, understand the new legal framework, the new standard, and say, here's the evidence we have. Will you, grand jury, do you think we have enough to indict under the new legal framework? And so very briefly, what we're looking at is this obstruction statute that federal prosecutors have used for many, many people involved in January 6th. Some were tried, some pled guilty. And the question was very specific in terms of the statutory language of whether or not it required essentially evidence tampering, whether or not it required a document to be involved in the allegations of trying to obstruct an official proceeding. The Supreme Court said yes, and Jack Smith today is saying that's fine, and there was an official document here. Now, we haven't read through everything yet, but what I expect that we will see is that the official documents at issue are those alleged fake slates of electors. That, according to Jack Smith, will be enough to satisfy the statute.
So it's interesting. We got a note from our own Scott McFarland, who, of course, deeply steeped, as you are, Jessica, in all things January 6th. But he also notes the same 4 charges, no new co-defendants added. The new superseding indictment, 9 pages shorter, and eliminates any reference to co-conspirator 4, which pertains to the allegation of criminal attempts to misuse the Justice Department for sham election investigations, a reference to Jeffrey Clark, who I believe is also indicted or at least implicated in at least one other, as you just mentioned, fake elector scheme in Georgia.
Well, that's right. And let's remember that there were 2 big Supreme Court cases. We're focusing on one of them, but 2 big Supreme Court cases that have affected this case. And one dealt with immunity, and one dealt with this obstruction of official proceeding statute. And the obstruction of official proceeding statute is the one that we've been talking about today, the one that was narrowed in scope as a result of that Fisher decision. But I think what you see in Jack Smith's decision to pare down is him, frankly, reacting to both of those Supreme Court decisions.
Okay, Jessica, stand by. Let us know if anything else stands out to you. Let's go ahead and go to CBS News Justice Department reporter Rob Legary, who joins us now. Robert, what stands out to you about what you've read?
Yeah, so just reading through this, as Jessica rightly said, this is a pared down indictment. The first one was 45 pages. The superseding indictment is, 45. This is about 35 pages. And so this is 9 or 10 pages less than what we had last year at this time. And the prosecutors and the special counsel appear to be following the Supreme Court's roadmap here, and specific information that is now left out, particularly as Jessica mentioned, the alleged conduct that prosecutors said Trump worked to pressure the Justice Department and enlist Justice Department officials in his alleged scheme following the 2020 election. That's gone. There were 5 alleged unnamed, unindicted co-conspirators in that original in the original indictment, including who we here at CBS News identified as one of them being then acting Assistant Attorney General Jeff Clark. He is also gone from the indictment. That individual, I think it was unindicted co-conspirator number 4, is no longer in the indictment. And so this really shows us that the prosecutors went through the original indictment and kind of took out issues that they said that they viewed as part of the Supreme Court knocking it out. Now remember, the Supreme Court in their immunity decision said explicitly that any conduct that Trump is alleged to have undertaken tied to the Justice Department was out of bounds. He was immune from being prosecuted for that because that was an official act. It is the president's official act, the Supreme Court said, his official job to interact with members of the Justice Department, and prosecutors cannot break into that immunity. They can't really touch that. The Supreme Court explicitly said that and basically disqualified that conduct from the indictment. So here Jack Smith is saying, okay, we don't need that anymore. We have these other things. Notably, Mike Pence and the conduct that prosecutors said Mike Pence or Trump worked to enlist Mike Pence in these acts. That's still included here, and that was a close call that the Supreme Court said would be a tough one for the judge to kind of parse through. They said Trump is presumptively immune from going over this, presumptively immune from conduct tied to the vice president, but here is still included. So this is going to be a tough question for Judge Chutkan to answer, and she's likely going to have hearings on it to figure out whether or not the conduct with Mike Pence is allowed to go forward. So
you have a byline on a CBSNews.com article from earlier in this month in which you report that Judge Chutkan is now expected to interpret and apply the Supreme Court's ruling. She'll have to decide which alleged conduct described is official in nature and which could be the subject of criminal prosecution, along the lines of what you were just telling us. But is Jack Smith essentially sort of getting ahead of all of these potential hearings with this superseding indictment, saying, look, we already went to a grand jury in the aftermath of the SCOTUS case in which this is, brought to light, and we still have an indictment here for you?
Right. So Judge Chutkan asked Jack Smith to basically lay out what he says should happen in the case by Friday. Here, the Justice Department is saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to show you what we think should be included. Because as you rightly said, Lindsay, the Supreme Court basically handed to Judge Chutkan the indictment again with their ruling and said, interpret our ruling, attach it to these charges, and then see what comes out in the mix. So basically go through, decide which alleged conduct in the indictment is official in nature, which is unofficial in nature, and from there decide what conduct can be included at trial. Because again, remember, Judge Chutkan, she is a trial judge. What we're doing here is, what she is doing here, what prosecutors and Trump's team are doing here, is trying to get to trial or figure out how this could be resolved. And so that is what her job is. And so her job is to apply the Supreme Court precedent to these charges. The special counsel here is saying we are going to get rid of things that we think that she would have disqualified or that the Supreme Court disqualified, and we are narrowing this. She likely still will have to do something related to the Mike Pence matter because that is still included in the indictment. The Supreme Court said that Trump is presumptively immune from anything related to Mike Pence. Here, in this indictment, notably, the special counsel cast Mike Pence not as vice president, but as Trump's running mate in the election. And so this is a purposeful change that the special counsel made in this new document. Pence is not just the vice president, but also his running mate, Trump's running mate here. And so the special counsel is trying to make that determination as well.
Just like we had a sort of a similar trickle of what could be perceived as positive news for Trump in his case, this is a very significant week for Jack Smith and their responses as they litigate this in the courts. We had you on yesterday. Remind us what the development was there in the Florida classified documents case.
Right. So as viewers will likely remember, last month, Judge Eileen Cannon dismissed the classified documents case, ruling that Trump was right when she said the special counsel was illegally appointed and was not lawfully put in his position. She basically found that because Jack Smith was not appointed by the president, approved by the Senate, he didn't have the right to then go forward with the case, an argument that Trump and his allies had made. Smith yesterday appealed that ruling officially to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing that he called that ruling nonsensical and basically said that there was a lot of legal matters that she got wrong, and asked the 11th Circuit to reverse her and allow that case to continue.
I want to bring Jessica Levinson back. Of course, Jessica, we've been talking about the role of Judge Chutkan and what will be before her, which is quite a lot, a great deal of work left in this case to still sort out.
Well, and I think that you and Rob were exactly right to focus on this as a response to the immunity ruling. And you and I were talking a little bit about that other ruling as well. But this is really an indictment that takes into account what the Supreme Court said in terms of creating 3 buckets of categories. And this is where we see Jack Smith say no. And you mentioned those paragraphs with respect to co-conspirator number 4. That's where we see a few of those paragraphs being pushed out, where Jack Smith thought under the Supreme Court's immunity ruling, those couldn't move forward. And so now that Jack Smith has filed this superseding indictment, which Judge Chutkan, as you and Rob were just talking about, she's going to have to say, which bucket do each of these allegations fall within? Because to remind everybody, what the court said is, when it comes to only those things that under the Constitution a former president can do, the core presidential functions, absolute immunity. And again, that's why we see some of the allegations just be dropped here, where Jack Smith said we can't go forward. Then when it comes to official conduct, a presumption of immunity, that's where Judge Chutkan is going to do a lot of work to try and figure out, are these allegations official conduct? And then with respect to the unofficial conduct, no immunity. Trying to figure out what falls within bucket number 2 or bucket number 3, as you just discussed, that's where Judge Chutkan is going to have to go through and be the first judge in the nation to apply that new standard that we see from the Supreme Court with respect to presidential immunity.
This may be pared down, Jessica, but still quite a significant indictment.
A very significant indictment. I know that, I and others say things like, look, you never want to be on the receiving end of a criminal indictment, and particularly one like this, a federal indictment. But I want to emphasize what you and I talked about before. All 4 charges are still there. Most of the factual allegations are still there. Jack Smith is saying what he said before, which is anything short of a Supreme Court decision that said, you just can't try a former president. You just can't criminally indict a former president. Jack Smith said, I have enough to move forward. And these are serious allegations here. And Jack Smith is saying very clearly, I can go forward, not on something that's significantly pared down, but on something that looks a lot like what I brought prior to that immunity decision by the Supreme Court.
Jessica Levinson, always appreciate you. Rob Legary, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I would just echo what Jessica had to say, and I'd also say that there's still a long road ahead in this case. There are some pretrial motions that have already been decided back in December when a lot of these issues were first raised. But now, as we've been alluding to, Judge Chutkan has a lot of work ahead of her because this indictment still has been filed and there's still 36 pages to go through. And so Trump's defense is likely going to go through and raise issues with each of these. The arguments that they had raised about presidential immunity in her courtroom months ago, they're going to raise again and apply the Supreme Court decision here. And so Jack Smith is not out of the woods here. There's still these arguments that have to go forward, and those close calls that the Supreme Court said Judge Chutkan will have to make, she's still going to have to do that. And so this is not the end of the road, but likely the beginning of new legal processes. Not
the end of the road, but the beginning of a new one. Rob Legary, thank you so much. Jessica Levinson. Just to recap everybody who is joining us, Special Counsel Jack Smith filed a superseding indictment against former President Trump today, in which he accused Trump of resisting the peaceful transfer of power after the 2020 presidential election. A pared down down superseding indictment, but still, as we were just discussing with Jessica, a very significant, same counts, no new defendants here, but certainly as Judge Chutkin in the D.C. District Court will have her work cut out for her as they move on with this case in the wake of that Supreme Court ruling saying that former presidents do have some immunity from official acts. We're going to take a short break. Up next, the latest on the largest Latin American civil rights organization calling for a federal investigation into a series of raids conducted by the Texas AG's office. You're watching CBS News 24/7.
These are the stories
1, 2, 3, go!
of we the people.
We're trying to generate our own hope.
It's a huge deal.
I'm enabling them to feel valued.
Eye on America, weeknights on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all